Bill Carroll, Z62 Media, and working our way through the draft class, we now come to a really intriguing group of defensive end prospects. And of course, the first of them, and the one who some people had as the number one prospect overall, I feel like he was one of the top prospects in this entire draft class, is Abdul from Penn State. We don't have any physical testing numbers in him. He declined and, of course, was recovering from an injury. My guess is he would have run somewhere in the mid to low 4.6s, possibly high 4.5s. Probably would have jumped in that 37-inch range. I mean, there's some spring testing numbers, which I don't always trust that we have on him, but he would have tested well. We don't know exactly how well, but he's a player that can play with his hand in the dirt and can stand up a little bit and drop into coverage. I think he's going to be used as that, add-on pass rusher who will occasionally, like I said, sort of like DeMarcus Ware, sometimes play like a linebacker as well. Next, we have Michael Williams from Georgia. Player with length and bend. Not quite as productive, not quite as explosive as Abdul Carter, but I think he ends up having a solid NFL career, and he goes to a really good spot because the San Francisco 49ers don't need him to be the guy, they need him to be the other guy. So he's going to probably slide into that role initially as a designated pass rusher. And then we come to maybe the most intriguing prospect possibly in the entire draft class in terms of just the dichotomy between potential and production. In Shamar Stewart, you have rare athletic traits. A player could probably play at 290, maybe even over 290 pounds, and probably still run, in the 4.7s to low 4.8s, even at that weight. Just tested. Some of his testing numbers are like those of a wide receiver. He is a truly special athlete. However, both on tape and when you break him down based on sort of historical thresholds for players at that position, if you see him as a true defensive end, and he came down to 267 pounds after playing at, probably 20-ish pounds above that during most of the season, but he ran 4.59, and even at close to 300, probably run in the mid to high 4.7s. Had a 40-inch vertical, which is just crazy for a 267-pound human being. A 10.11 broad jump, once again, an insane number. The numbers that are less insane, of course, are his actual, numbers that came in terms of what he produced as a prospect. Everyone's talked about the 4.5, career sacks. That's in 3 years. That's an average of 1.5 sacks per year. Admittedly, he was played very differently and used very differently from how he's likely to be used as a professional. If he's going to be asked to be a pure pass rusher, it'll be the first time really since high school that he's been asked to do that. Even in high school, at times, back at Monsignor Pace, even then he moved around a little bit, was closer to being a pass rusher purely then. When I asked him at the Combine about who he compared himself to, he mentioned by name Jadeveon Clowney, who of course is currently a free agent, just being released by the Carolina Panthers. There's a lot to like about Shamar Stewart, and of course you're saying to your staff, we trust you. We trust you to develop this extremely talented prospect. Speaking of another talented prospect, way more production, but a few question marks. I don't think there's a huge character issue with James Pearce Jr. I think that there's some personality stuff, and I think about Charles Haley, though not to that extent. If you have the right setup, if you have the right culture, if you have the right locker room, it'll probably be just fine. The good news, he goes to the Falcons. The Falcons are a relatively welcoming kind of setting. And while the press isn't softball press, it's not what you'd find in some of the markets like New York or, New Jersey, I guess, but the New York / New Jersey market or Philadelphia or some of those really tough media markets. But he will obviously have to be managed, not so much in terms of, what he does on the field, but just to make sure that people know who they're getting and who he is. But I don't think it'll be a problem. One of my favorite pass rushers goes next at pick 44 to the Dallas Cowboys. Shout out to the Cowboys for getting Dominez Araku at this point. He has so much, once again, production, but also so much potential still. Winner of the Ted Hendricks Award last year as the top defensive end / outside linebacker in all of college football. Defensive end, I guess, really. But he can play Sam linebacker, right? He's a good enough athlete, one of the better athletes at the position. Definitely knows a little bit about coverage. I've seen him do it a little bit. A really good football player. And then we have JT Tiamalau going to the Indianapolis Colts for the next selection at pick 45. They can use defensive linemen. he can, once again, give some flexibility in terms of where he lines up. Can be a 5 tech, can be a traditional defensive end. More of that base end, the other guy, right? As opposed to, once again, a primary pass rusher, but a really good football player is going to have an 8 to 10 year career. Another one of those players, once again, I joke about the curse of Texas A&M, but Nick Scarton was a player that if you watch him in his days at Purdue, you come away thinking this is a surefire top 20, 25 type prospect. What happened at Texas A&M? Someday there'll be a 30 for 30 about the 4 and 5 stars that find their way to Texas A&M, especially on the defensive line, and what happens to them. Nonetheless, he's a really good football player. Fell in love with him a little bit while I was watching Purdue, and Purdue has a nice little, line of pass rushers, of the Roosevelt Colvins and many others that have come through that program, and Karlaftis most recently. He's 6'2" and 3/4, slimmed back down to 257. Once again, another guy that played heavier in his time at A&M. Not sure why. I don't know if he was told to do it or if it just sort of happened, but I think you're going to see him more like the player you saw at Purdue if he plays in the upper 250s, low 260s. That now brings us to pick number 52, and Olufemi Oladejo. Once again, another player where you're going a little bit more with the upside, right? You're going more with potential over production. Though he's not been unproductive, there's players that I would have picked before him if I were basing it off production. So I'm assuming that they aren't. The other good thing is he's going to be a guy that can play linebacker. He's a younger prospect, right? He won't turn 22 until the season begins. Was a former Golden Bear. Cal has been really doing a great job of recruiting on the defensive side of the ball. In his 2 years in UCLA, in 25 games, he had 111 tackles, 17 of them tackles for loss. 5 of those were sacks, 5 pass deflections, and also had an interception in there. I truly believe this is another player who's probably more of like a rotational kind of guy, who at least initially, and maybe down the road, turns to a starter. 20 bench reps with 33 and 3/8 inch arms, which is reasonably good for a guy's 259 pounds. 36.5 inch vertical, you like that. 10-foot broad, you like that. So there's things to like about him. I think about some of those guys that the Ravens have drafted recently, right? So sort of in the Ojabo, sort of that role, that type of guy who's you're hoping to develop into something. He's raw. I think about Kwity Paye. I think about some of those guys who you're once again looking at what they could be and not what they are. But the roll of the dice isn't too expensive, I guess, at pick 52. I actually prefer, just on tape, the next player at pick 66 is Ashton Shalat from Louisville going to the Kansas City Chiefs, who can use an infusion of talent along that pass rush line. Now, if you have Chris Jones and obviously Karlaftis, if you're mixing Shalat in along with the other players like Aniziki, from previous drafts, I feel like there's real potential there. Another Florida kid. People say he's undersized. He's really not. He came in at 264 pounds, so that's actually decent size. You look for things that sort of let you know what kind of player you're going to get. A 4.65 40 at 264 is actually not bad at all. 36.5 inch vertical, a 6.94 3-cone, which is one of the top 3 cones amongst the defensive ends. And then you add to that the production, right, and a 10-foot broad. 24 bench reps, right? With the arm length is a little below what you're shooting for at 31 and 7/8 inch, but I'm not worried about that because he really knows how to beat people with his feet, and he's got a really decent array of pass rush moves. I think he's in the top 5 in tackles for loss and sacks amongst this defensive end class. That's my belief. Moving on, Landon Jackson. This is a player that some people had at the very tail end of the first or the early part of the second. He makes it to the Bills at pick 72. The Bills have a type, right? They like big, broad-shouldered, thick-bodied guys, and they got another one. Landon Jackson is sort of in that Epinesa mold, though I think he's a little less raw than Epinesa, as a pass rusher, a little less raw than Epinesa was. And once again, gave Will Campbell probably some of his worst reps on tape. And he's a guy that comes in at 6'6", 264 pounds, played in the low 270s, and could get back up, probably could get to 280 without losing much. 4.68 in the 40, which is really nice for a guy that size. 4.55 in the short shuttle, a 7.13 3-cone. All of the testing numbers, 40.5-inch vertical, 10.9 broad. All the testing numbers are really good numbers. And in the Senior Bowl itself was, in my mind, the defensive MVP had a 1.5 sacks, including 1.5 tackles, and a strip sack. The other thing that I think really impressed me when I threw on the tape, in addition to obviously the reps against people like Will Campbell, he's very good at setting hard edges. He plays hard against the run as much as he does against the pass. Had 44 tackles, 13.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks. He's never going to be a consistent double-digit sack guy, I don't think. I think he's more in that 5.5 to 8.5 range, which is still fine. And I think he has a solid NFL career for 8 to 10 years. Another upside, a lot of upside picks here. Princey Mamalian is a player that sort of each year you'd hear well, this is the year, right? This is the year. He did not have a bad career. Starting out at Florida, right? Early on, he shows up as a true freshman, had, 2 sacks, right? Then the next year, 17 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, 1 sack, a forced fumble, and including a strip sack on Hayes King in the win over Texas A&M before, of course, King transfers to Georgia Tech. Then his best year at Florida, he had 39 tackles, 9.5 of those were TFLs, 4.5 sacks, and 2 forced fumbles. And then, of course, he ends up being talked about, as someone who might be, a possible drafted player at that point, finds a way to Ole Miss. Doesn't quite have the season I think he or other people were expecting, especially with how talented that Ole Miss defensive line was. You're maybe expecting a little bit more. But all the pieces are there, right? He's got the length, reasonably strong, not a freakish athlete. Maybe the one sort of thing that maybe helps to explain why it is you didn't quite break out the way you're expecting. But, he's legitimately 6'4". He's going to play linebacker, can reduce down and also play defensive end as well. Pick 77 to the Panthers. Solid. 33 and 7/8 arms, long arms, 6'4" and 3/8, almost 6'4" and a half. 4'7", 240. It's not bad. It's not mind-boggling, but it's not bad. 3-cone Joe 715 is solid. 38-inch vertical is really good, and the 10.6 broad. So he's got some lower body pop and explosion. Needs to get better. More pop in his hands, more power, and use his length better. Then we come next to Jordan Burch, the other Oregon defensive lineman, and once again a fun player on tape. While I don't think he's going to, and once again, maybe he's a linebacker, but he starts his career out South Carolina, has a couple of good games, including an interception. He returned 61 yards for a touchdown, and he looks good doing it. Like, you can tell he's had the ball in his hands before. In his best season at South Carolina, he had 60 tackles, 3.5 sacks, and then, of course, finds his way to Oregon. He played in the 270s, could probably weigh 280 without hurting him, and could get down to 260-something without hurting him probably as well. 4'6", 40 is really good for a 279-pound human being. And, he's more O.C. Umenyiora than he is Michael Strahan, but he's still going to be a really solid player. He goes to the Cardinals, who could definitely use him. I think he sees the field probably between 31 and 38% of the snaps, even as a rookie. Good football player. That brings us now to Josiah Stewart, another really solid Michigan player. I don't think he, becomes a spectacular professional, but I think he becomes a good, solid professional. And he's probably going to be used essentially as a linebacker who walks down and becomes that situational pass rusher at times. His production is solid. Never spectacular, but solid. In his best season at Michigan, he was an All-American back in 2023. And then this last year, he had 13 tackles for loss, which was a great number, 8.5 sacks and 2 forced fumbles. There's a lot to like. I just think that, like I said, he's more of the other guy than he is the guy. But he goes to the Rams, picked number 90 overall. The Rams have a pretty good track record of selecting defensive players. I think that, like I said, they have a role for him, and he'll fulfill that role. Then we come to the Steelers at pick 123. The Steelers had kind of an odd, not a bad draft, but an odd draft, right? But this is, to me, one of their better value picks. When you're getting a player like Jack Sawyer, I think he's going to produce at that second tier level. Like he'll never once again be that double digit sack guy, and he's going to play outside linebacker. But he'll once again there are multiple front like so many teams. There are times when he's going to step up and put his hand in the dirt. Before I forget, I jumped over Savion Jones from LSU. LSU had a lot of players in this draft, and one of the more interesting ones is Savion Jones. Things to like about Savion Jones. Once again, another guy with a good frame, right? Comes in at 6'5" and 3/8, almost 6'5" and a half. He's 280 pounds. Could carry 300 pounds if you want to make him into a 5-tech. 4.74 in the 40, which is really good. 33-inch vert is solid. 9.11 broad, not terrible. And 19 bench reps, that was the most surprising, right? He has 33.5-inch arms, which is, slightly above average, but not freakish. So maybe a couple more reps you'd like to see. So maybe you want to get him in the weight room. But he is a younger player. Once again, 21 years of age. Will turn 22 shortly before the season begins. In his best season, he was a producer, but not dominant, right? At no point did he dominate. He was a guy that ever took over any games. He's a rotational player, but probably one with some upside. Mentioned Jack Sawyer. Here's one of my favorite selections. Not because he'll end up being the best player in the draft class, but because he goes to a team that, one, I think truly understands and values what he is, and two, will allow him time to develop, and that's Barron Sorrell from Texas. He's going to work hard. He's got a really nice frame, like a lot of the guys. It's a good-sized group physically. He comes in at 6'3" and a quarter, 256, but he played heavier during the season. 32 and a quarter, which is right about average in terms of arm length. 4.68 in the 40 is nice. That's a nice time for a guy his size. 7.06 3-cone is actually really good. That's a fantastic 3-cone for a 256-pound human being. 34-inch vert, slightly above average. 10-1 broad, slightly above average, and 28 bench reps. For a guy with 32 and a quarter inch arms, probably about what you'd expect. I think that he has eventual starter potential. I think that while at first he'll be probably a situational guy for the Packers, a rotational guy for the Packers, eventual starter. Then Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, another one of those Georgia defensive linemen. I think he has a nice career, but I don't think he's a guy that ever becomes a full-time, guy. I mean, I think he's another guy that plays in certain situations. Once again, things you like. Young, right? Another guy who won't turn 21. Well, he'll turn 21 in the summer. 22. He's 21 now. Will turn 22 in the summer. 6'4" and 3/4, right? 276 pounds. 33.5-inch arms. Good length. 4.86 in the 40 is... it's not terrible for a 276-pounder, but it's not mind-boggling, but it's solid. The 7.28 3-cone is meh. 36 vert, that's one of the more impressive numbers. 10.4 broads above average. 23 bench reps was, I once again, a little lower than I was expecting. 2 or 3 reps off of what I was expecting. And once again, going to the Vikings, there'll be a place for him, right? He'll play. I just don't know if he'll ever be more than like a rotational player. But at pick 139, that's fine. Then we come to the New England Patriots, who'd use everything. See, this is what sort of interested me. I think Braden Swinson might be a better player, both initially and maybe even down the line, than Ingram-Dawkins. But he goes 7 selections later at pick 146. Swinson, I would say it's an outside chance he becomes a full-time starter. But he's got real chances, I think, to become something. Starts his career at Oregon, has a pretty decent career there. I would say probably his best games or best times you get to see him. He shows up in 2022, had 8 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss. The season before that, he actually had a start against Ohio State, 5 tackles, a sack, and a pass deflection in that game. Why he didn't see the field more in Oregon? That's a great question. But this past year, 35 tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss. 2 of those were sacks, 5 pass deflections, 2 forced fumbles. He's a borderline starter, I think, eventually, but comes in at 6'3" and 5'8". You like the length at 33 and 3/8 inch, and the arms 255. Good 3-cone, good short shuttle. Not a freak, right, but a good athlete. In the right place, like I said, at least a high level rotational to low level starter. I really like the next pick at pick 157, Elijah Roberts. This is a player who I also give outside chances to be. There's only one other player I think turns into an eventual starter amongst the defensive ends who gets picked even later than him, and we'll get to him in a moment. But starts his career at Miami, right? In his time there, in 3 years, he is in 20 games, had a start, 21 tackles over that 20 games. Once again, part-time player, 2 tackles for loss, also had half a sack, forced fumble. Best year actually comes after the transfer, obviously, at SMU. Starts in all 14 games, had 37 tackles, 12 and a half tackles for loss, 10 sacks, and 2 forced fumbles. You could say level of competition, but SMU, just to remind people, is playing solid competition, right? They played Miami, right? They played. People think, maybe they forget, they're in the ACC. 6'3" and 3/8, 5/8. So 6'3" and 5/8, 285. So once again, that bigger body, maybe a Peyton Turner, Colby Turner type, 33 and 5/8 inch, 10 and a quarter inch hands. That's big hands. 4'7", 8. Not terrible for a 285 pounder. A guy who could be a 5 tech. And then 31 and a half inch vertical. That's okay. 9'8" broad, solid. 25 bench reps for 285. That's not killing it exactly, but it's not terrible. I do like that pick. And then we come to Tyler Barron, another one of the Miami defensive ends, right? A former teammate of Mr. Roberts. Things about Mr. Barron, who started his career at Tennessee. Things I saw and things that sort of impressed me or that I liked. I think the most impressive thing about him, you go back even to the tape at Tennessee, right? And he had 13 starts in 2022, 22 tackles, 2.5 sacks, and instant transfer portal, ends up at Miami. At one point, had considered both Louisville, Ole Miss, but he settles in at Miami. And solid career, altogether. 6'4" and 5/8, 258. So, got good length, 33 and an 1/8 inch arms. The 4'6", 240 is really good for that guy that size. The 7'4" cone is not. I'm a little concerned about that. Maybe a little stiffness there. 35 and average verticals, above average. 10-1 broad, solid. 19 bench reps for 33 and 1/8 inch arms. Not the best. But the thing that worries me most is the recon. That could indicate some stiffness or maybe just bad technique. Another player that I really like, I think he's more of a rotational player than a starter, but he's going to be a productive rotation player, is Amin Hussein. If you watched him at Boise, as I did, you saw there's a player that gave tremendous effort, was one of the leaders of the defense, and his big season was 2023. He had 53 tackles that year, 17 tackles for loss, 12 and a half sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and was, first team All Mountain West, and I thought the defensive player of the conference that year. Not bad, right? Not a bad season. That year, this last year, 2024, 48 tackles, 16 tackles for loss, 9.5 sacks. That would be a great year for most people. And was, once again, first team All Conference. Things to like about him. Once again, powerful build, right? He comes in at 6'2" and 3/8, 267. Had played a little heavier at times. Could play lighter, probably, too. 4'7", which is not a bad 40 for a guy his size. 7'1" 3-cone, right? Compared to the 258-pounder with the 7'4" 3-cone. Yeah, I just talked about a moment ago. 32 and a half inch vertical. That's not bad. 32 bench reps, right? That tells you about the power. 32 and a quarter inch arms is average, but the 32, if it was 22 bench reps with 32 and a quarter inch arms, I'd be concerned. He knocked out 32. He's one of the strongest defensive ends in the group. I think he's that base end, that guy that anchors. Very good against the run. We talk about his pass rushing, but he's also good against the run. I really like that pick. I think the Lions are going to like him. I think he's going to end up being, by value, one of the best picks for the Lions. And then we come to, how do the Eagles keep doing it? This is one of the guys I think could actually become a starter, is Antoine Powell-Ryland. Tremendous effort. Something about those Virginia Tech guys, right? Try to find a loaf on tape. It's hard to find loafs on tape for those guys. Am I a little bit prejudiced because he's from the 757? Maybe a tiny bit. Portsmouth, Virginia, shout out to him. But 6'2" and 5'8", 258. Frankly, the 6'2" and 5'8" was a win. I thought he might even be shorter. I was comparing to people like Darryl Tapp and, Hugh Douglas and, Brandon Graham. He's not actually super short. 31 and a quarter inch arms is obviously not what you're loving. You would like to see, 32 and up. 33 is really where people get excited. But 4.69 to 40 for 258, solid. 38-inch vert is really good. 10-4 broad is solid. So, went to Indian River High School, which actually is the closest high school to me where I grew up because I was in the western part of Virginia Beach. Uh, but he's a good football player. And I just think that the Eagles are one of the best landing spots for him. They've had players like him before who've had good, solid success. I think they stand him up at times and they have him play with his hand in the dirt at times. I will not be surprised if when it's all said and done, he's a 50-plus sack guy in his NFL career. And last, but certainly not least, in the defensive end class is Fadil Diggs, another guy who could probably play linebacker, and also has played with his hand in the dirt. Diggs is a very good athlete. Guy with a good football IQ too. I think people underestimate how much that matters. A guy who escaped the curse of Texas A&M. In his time there, his last year there in 2023, had 36 tackles. 11 of those were tackles for loss and 4 sacks. Very intriguing prospect. And then at Syracuse, right, a big get for Syracuse. Shout out to Thomas Brown and the recruiting work that he and his staff have done. He ends up being a terrific player that year and a team captain, right? When a guy comes that late to a program, becomes a team captain, it's impressive. Comes in at 6'4" and 3/8", 257. So that long, lean build, 33 3/8 arms, good length, 4.57 40. That's fantastic for a person that size. The short shuttle's not that great. It's okay. 4.39. Skips the 3-cone. 30.5-inch vertical is the most scary number, right? That tells you that he doesn't have a super strong lower body. 10-1 broad is okay. And the 26 bench reps is actually pretty good for a guy with 33. In fact, very good for a 33 3/8 arms. Now, I think Diggs is truly a stand-up guy. I think that you can occasionally put him with his hand in the dirt, but he's one of those guys you just tell him, we move you around, we find matchups for you. He may never be a full-time starter, but could he be a guy that gives you 4.5 to 6 sacks, even as a guy who's playing, 25 to 35% of the snaps? I think yes. It's an interesting group of defensive ends. Once again, Bill Carroll for Zinni62 Media, and I'll be plowing through the rest of this draft class. I will see you again soon. Please like and subscribe.